Today I'd like to talk about two diametrically opposed philosophical schools of thought, idealism and materialism. Idealism is the concept that it is the mind that shapes the reality around us. That said, reality is immaterial, and without the conscious mind, events would not transpire in the way that they do. Concepts such as mind over matter, the law of attraction, karma, a man's inherent sense of good and evil are rooted in such notions. Ultimately, idealism is a metaphysical concept of self-creating the reality, and it is oftentimes more associated with the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate. Some idealist philosophers of note would be George Hegel, George Berkeley, and Immanuel Kant. Then there is materialism, which is the opposite worldview. Materialism is the philosophical notion that the reality we live in is ultimately physical, and that it is the material world and conditions that shape the individual, not the other way around. The universe is only matter, and it is the reactions between material forces that discern the outcomes and behaviors of men and plants and animals. Concepts such as an individual being a product of one's environment, influence, and the emergent propensities of nature apply here. Materialism looks at the circumstances surrounding an individual or phenomenon and considers the general pressures that lead to such outcomes. Some materialist philosophers of note would include Ludwig Feuerbach and Friedrich Engels. Out of the two, it is from the materialist worldview that sociology was ultimately born. After all, when looking at the material conditions of a person or groups of people, it is easy to see why people act and behave the way that they do. If you take a look back at the earliest agrarian societies, many of them around the world have customs centered around sun worship, while others have developed rituals to make it rain. Well, why do you think that is? Could it be because these people instinctively knew that it was the warmth and the light brought by the sun that allowed their crops to fare well, and that it was the rain that came pouring down that would allow their farms to grow and cultivate? Or how about the fertility gods and goddesses? Back in 4000 BC, having children was absolutely paramount to the survival of a community, so there was a necessity to create and worship such deities. Now, why is it that people in ancient times just made up all these powerful entities out of nowhere? I have an answer to that. It's because on one hand, they knew these elements were essential to their survival, but at the same time, due to their lack of understanding of the natural world, these people filled the gaps with their own imagination, developing customs and superstitions to help cope with their own ignorance, and at the same time, providing means to attain their needs through metaphysical beliefs. What's that glowing thing in the sky? Well, it's the sun god. Why did my daughter get sick? Perhaps the gods are mad at me. So oddly enough, it was out of these material conditions that gave rise to sun worship, rain dances, and the first idealistic beliefs. If we do the right dance, or sacrifice a virgin to the volcano god, we can make it rain, or we can have a bountiful hunt. Well, today, now that we understand precipitation and the wind currents, it's safe to say no amount of dancing or smoking of sacred herbs will cause it to rain. Now we know the sun is just a flaming ball of gas out in the middle of space and not a deity of infinite light. As time has gone on, and we have slowly taken a more materialist position on the world, rather than assuming a preconceived conclusion at the onset, we have started to ask why such phenomenon occurs in the first place. Slowly but surely, we are beginning to see things for what they actually are. And though we are far more technologically advanced than we used to be, there are still many idealistic notions that persist to this day. One such example is the concept of good and evil. This concept is rooted in value systems and institutions around the world. Particularly here in the West, it stems from our society's Judeo-Christian roots. There's a spiritual war between good and evil, and people just choose to do good or choose to do evil. They make this choice of their own volition, so for their transgression, they are a sinner and must repent or be punished. I'm sure we've heard this one a million times. The concept of good and evil is once again an idealistic notion, for it completely voids the condition that drive people to make the choices that they make in the first place. What is it that compels a man to pick up a sharp piece of metal, a wooden board, and join a great mass so that he may go forth and fight another army to the death? There are many answers to that, It could be a sense of pride, honor, patriotism, and his sense of duty to protect the community. So does that make him evil for going forth and killing several people? After all, he's just doing what he thinks is right. Or how about a mother who steals food to feed her starving children? From an idealist notion, that would make her a bad person because she stole from somebody else. But from a materialist worldview, one can see she is simply doing what she has to do to take care of her own. In conclusion, when people's survival is on the line, they will do what is necessary to survive, even if that means doing what we normally perceive as wrong or immoral. And then there's the issue of addiction. Addiction can be described as when somebody is compulsively driven to seek instant gratification using or doing something while lacking the self-control to stop. Many people think drugs when they hear addiction. However, drugs in and of themselves are not inherently addictive. And at the same time, anything can be addictive. Gambling can be addictive. Sex can be addictive. And so can shopping, or eating, or making money, or power for that matter. The idealist will attribute addiction to something as an inherent character flaw. Oh, that person's just like that. Some people just don't know how to control themselves. Or that's at least how the American legal system sees these people. Again, it's the assumption that the mind is perfectly agent and in control and has the power to shape the environment or the conditions surrounding the individual. The materialist will look at the conditions that make somebody an addict. Perhaps the alcoholic drinks a bottle of whiskey a day because a relative is dead and he's using it to cope. Perhaps the lazy stoner just sits around and smokes weed all day because he or she doesn't have any friends or doesn't know what they want to do with their lives. Maybe the wealthy billionaire who continues to be cutthroat and seek profit at the expense of others does so because he is endlessly rewarded for it and is seen as one to be venerated by the culture. It is interesting how our society is so concerned about the poor addicts who have no influence over anything, and at the same time glorifies the rich addicts who have influence over everyone and everything, and regularly engage in socially destructive behavior for their own self-interest. At the end of the day, the idealist worldview leads to utopian schools of thought and short-sightedness with respect to the roots of social problems. It is this mindset that has conservatives and liberals debating over the same issues for over 100 years or more without ever considering a bigger picture. The most common of these debates include abortion, gun control, balancing the budget, and how much or little government there should be, as though government is just a scalar value, and the less government there is, the more freedom, the more government there is, the less freedom. My message to you, viewer, is to take a step back. Take a more objective look at things. Don't just look at the world through a lens of, if people just act like this, or if we just do this, this, and that, things will be better. Take the time to self-reflect and seek out the flaws in your own perspectives and try to correct them. If you can't think of a way to prove your own dispositions wrong, then that's a sign that you are on the right track to having a more scientific mind. Learn to ask the question why certain events transpire. Why do people choose to behave as they do? And how we can change the environment so that people start to behave in ways that are more desirable and productive to society as a whole. In other words, think bigger.